Okay, so why compare? There are different modes of comparison, as Manali just said. One way is to compare select case studies, particular case studies. They can be not ones that support your theory or typology, but ones that counter it or are difficult for it. But so one way is to have a theory or typology and then look at particular cases to try and support that theory. Another one is the more sort of positivist way of doing it, which is to compare multiple cases and test out some kind of causal hypothesis. Almost, I mean, a kind of qualitative version of a multiple, regression analysis in statistics and so on. A third way is to descriptively contrast particular historical cases, talking about them in a nuanced and holistic way in order to highlight differences between the cases in a narrative fashion. And implicitly, there might be some kind of attempt to explain these differences at the same time. Now, all of these various approaches, I think, depend on the idea of the case. The case as a bounded separate unit that Yael was talking about this morning, the bubble. And the risk there is that this neglects historical connections and commonalities. And I think lots of people have mentioned history. I too am an anthropologist that loves history. So I think that's very important. It also tends to make each of your cases into a kind of homogeneous whole, which glosses over the internal diversity of that happens within each case, whatever that case happens to be. So what's a relational approach to comparison? So, I mean, relationality isn't opposed to comparisons. It's just a different way of doing comparison. So I'm not against comparison at all. Many of my recent projects have had a comparative dimension to them, including ones I've done with Monica. But it's a particular way of undertaking that comparison. So a relational approach tends to focus on historical interconnections. You've got your hand up? No. Emiko's striking a pose in the back there. It's like, what? Okay. So these connections obviously blur apparent boundaries because they create connections that between different apparently separate cases that create commonalities. Therefore, a relational approach also highlights those commonalities, rather than and at the same time, by highlighting commonalities, it sees differences. It doesn't ignore differences, but it emphasizes that those differences are contextual and shifting and depend fundamentally on the perspective of the person making the comparison. So there's those kinds of differences are always interested. They have an agenda behind them in terms of making an argument about those differences. So in that sense, relation is not between two sort of separate terms. The idea of the relation actually includes those terms, which means that those terms are seen as mutually constitutive. And Marilyn Strathern has written at some length about that concept of relation and relationality. So just as one example, I'm going to go into a bit more depth about this. Nicole Siegel's work on US-Brazil comparisons, her book Uneven Encounters, goes into great depth about how the US and Brazil, which were always used as this kind of opposite binary comparison, actually have a long history of being in conversation with each other. So that people in Brazil would be looking at what was going on in the USA, people in the USA would be looking at what was going on in Brazil. When Brazilians made statements about themselves, they were thinking, okay, how will my statement be received in the USA? So this kind of hall of mirrors effect, where people are looking at you, sort of thing, and then what you say about who you are and how you're different from other people is influenced by how you think those other people are going to perceive you. So if we look briefly at a kind of history of the comparisons that have been made of racial formations in the Americas, as Latin Americanists here will know, and maybe others too, Latin America has typically been seen as the binary opposite of the US, and the US here, again, taken as a kind of benchmark, a model of what racism really looks like. So if we start with middle of the 19th century, Latin American nation-building elites tried to, in their comparisons they made, opposing themselves to the USA, they were claiming a moral high ground by saying that we as Latin American nations, which are made up of mixed people, we have racial democracies. We're not the same as the USA. The USA, which is supposed to be the beacon of democracy, etc., is actually a highly racially unequal nation where there's racial hatred and so on. And those kind of elite statements, which were done by diplomats and intellectuals and politicians and so on, who were claiming the moral high ground for their new nations on a global stage, that filtered down to become a kind of common sense distinction. So you can easily find, even today, you can find people making these kinds of statements about how, oh yeah, racism, racial hatred, racial violence, oh yeah, that happens in the USA, not here in Brazil, not here in Colombia, not here in Ecuador, etc. So, a discourse of racial, maybe not racial democracy, but certainly racial kind of conviviality or racial tolerance in Latin America. So in the 20th century, you get historians, a whole sort of bunch of historical work, which is interested in making these comparisons between the Latin America and the US, usually the southern US and Brazil specifically. And they're not so interested in claiming some kind of moral high ground or trying to argue that one place is racially democratic or something necessarily. What they're really interested in is why there was so much race mixture in Latin America, specifically Brazil, and why manumission was so much more common in Latin America than in Brazil, which led to this intermediate, large, mixed, free class or strata of people that just didn't occur in the USA. So Frank Tannenbaum's Slave and Citizen, the Negro in the Americas, sort of started off this trend, but there was a load of other historians chipped in trying to sort of explain those things in terms of demography, in terms of labor regimes, in terms of attitudes and legal traditions, of Iberian versus Anglo cultures. There were also, in the kind of later 20th century, a series of more sociological comparisons of Latin America and the US, which again weren't trying to argue that one place was a racial democracy versus another. They were more interested in trying to sort of contrast racial formations and styles of racism. And I won't go into detail there, but one element in that sociological comparison was, towards the end of the 20th century, was the idea that Latin America and the USA, rather than being opposed to each other, were beginning to converge, as in the so-called Latin Americanization of the US. So the idea was there that the US was, after desegregation and with the increasing presence of Latino populations, kind of brown populations, but also Asian populations, it was beginning to look more like the kind of three-tier system of Latin America, which has a black and a white and black indigenous and white, and then this kind of brown middle. And at the same time, in Brazil especially, but also in other areas of Latin America, you get the increasing politicization of blackness, and in Brazil specifically, racial quotas, affirmative action quotas in higher education and in federal employment, at the very time that the USA was giving up those kind of affirmative action programs. Brazil and other Latin American countries were introducing them. So it seemed like they were on a kind of convergent path. But still the idea was that there were cases, that they were sort of, although they were converging, there was no talk about how they were, or very little talk about how they were exchanging between each other, or the kind of interconnections between them. They just happened to be on a convergent path. And here also there was the idea that somehow Latin America held some lessons for understanding the US. So Eddie Telles, in his book about Brazil, said that Brazil might have some valuable lessons for the United States about how racism in the US was operating post-segregation, or post-racially, in very big inverted commas. Stanley Bailey also said that a thorough understanding of Brazil could aid in anticipating attitudes and dynamics that may develop in the United States. So the same kind of idea. And specifically, Jonathan Warren and Christina Sue wrote an article called subtitled "What Anti-Racists Can Learn from Latin America," and they sort of drew out various lessons, but the most important ones were that extensive race mixture doesn't undermine racism. The fact that you have extensive race mixture can easily coexist with a certain kind of racism, and also that color blindness that you find apparently, that is often claimed to exist in Latin America, or a kind of liberal race evasive pluralism, or more recently multiculturalism, can also coexist very easily with racial inequality. So neither of those things, which are features, have been claimed as features of Latin America, necessarily lead to greater racial equality. So if we take a relational approach to these comparisons, the thing that I want to emphasize is that in all this, we have to ask whether Latin America or the United States, as cases, in inverted commas, really stand for just one thing, right? So, in some ways, that's a useful shorthand. I mean, it's the one I've used myself in a kind of textbook I wrote about race, which looked at the USA, Latin America, and Europe as the kind of three areas. I said US is kind of basically, we can think about it as being shaped by segregation. Latin America, on the other hand, is a racial formation that's fundamentally shaped by mixture. And we can think about Europe as a set of racial formations fundamentally shaped by post-colonial immigration. So that's a kind of useful shorthand for thinking about those things, a useful way of thinking about it. But what does that miss? That also misses a lot of things. It misses that segregation, mixture, and post-colonial migrations exist in all those three regions and all operate in those three regions in different ways. So if you look at the USA, you can see, and the history of the USA, you can see that mixture in Anglo-American colonies and in the post-colonial US was a constant process and a constant matter of concern, right? So it wasn't just a mixture, isn't just a Latin American phenomenon. It happens everywhere and in Europe as well. And it's a process and a matter of concern and policy. Also whitening, which is something that is said to be characteristic of Latin America through race mixture, seen as a whitening process. Whitening also occurs in the USA, as we know. Groups that were historically defined as non-white, Irish, Italian, Jewish, etc., over a period, during the 20th century, become officially white in the sense, in a census way. And also, we know, especially now, that it isn't only Europe that's concerned with immigration. Obviously, the US is, we know, extremely concerned with it at the moment, but also that's got a long history to it in terms of thinking about immigration as part of the way in which the racial formation of the United States is occurring. So if we look at Latin America, which has often been seen as a kind of class society where segregation is based on class lines, a lot of work has been done now to show how that class segregation has got strong racialized dimensions to it. So segregation is also part of the Latin American experience. And as we know, immigration is also an issue in Latin American racial formation, historically, and of course, even more now, as we see these migrations of Venezuelans and Haitians in Mexico or Haitians in Chile and so on, create these intense foci of racialized thinking and conflict. And the Fitzgerald and Cook-Martin book, Culling the Masses, is a very good examination of racist immigration policy right across the Americas. And if we also look at the classic idea that the US as a society is this kind of race dominate, it's where race takes precedence over class. People think about race all the time. Race is the dominant feature in social stratification, versus the idea that Latin America is basically a class society with some kind of racialized dimensions. That kind of opposition, I think, is unhelpful because it doesn't recognize that both these regions have race and class intersect in different ways, but they're both, it's unhelpful to think about Latin America as class with a little bit of race and the US as race with a little bit of class. You have to examine how race and class intersect and intertwine in these areas. And I've been particularly interested in how in Latin America, and in work that me and Monica did, we can talk about what I term this racially aware class consciousness in Latin America, which is that people may think and respond to in an interview primarily in terms of kind of class, but if you actually talk to them, say, okay, what's that got to do with race and racism? You will often find that opens a kind of floodgate where they're very aware that their racialized status is not disconnected from the fact that they're being screwed over by class processes of dispossession, displacement, unemployment, etc., etc. But they don't necessarily advertise that fact. They don't talk publicly about it, but they are very aware of it. So that's to conclude that rather than leaning into contrasts and differences, a relational approach highlights shared ground, segregation, mixture, immigration, the intertwining of race and class, and, as Manali was saying, the intersection of racism and sexism, which I haven't mentioned. The relational approach explores how these common dynamics operate in different ways in different contexts. And we're alive to how ideas and techniques rooted in these dynamics travel across contexts, connecting them and cultivating that shared terrain. Okay, thank you.